Welcome to episode 110 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's February 18, 1882. We're in Belfast, at the Knock Ground in Bloomfield, for a match that feels less like a contest and more like a collision between two stages of football's evolution. Ireland are playing their first ever international. England are already England, organized, experienced, hardened by a decade of representative football, and carrying the quiet confidence of a country that believes it owns the sport. By full time, the scoreboard reads Ireland 0, England 13. Yes, 13. And here's what made this day worth an OTD episode. This isn't just a freak result. It's a snapshot of football in its adolescence, when the game had rules, yes, and cups and crowds, but the infrastructure was wildly uneven from place to place, and international football, still brand new, was the harshest mirror of all. But how did we get here? 2 days ago, in episode 108, we went back to Sheffield in 1867, the Uten Cup, football's first tournament, a cup run before the phrase even existed. A few years later, 1871, the FA Cup arrives, which I spoke about in episode 11, and suddenly English clubs have a national stage. Then a year later, in 1872, international football is invented, England versus Scotland, and the sport gets a new idea entirely, nations as teams. Episode 30 was dedicated to that first international. But in 1882, there's still no football league. That won't arrive for another 6 years. So the sport's center of gravity is cups, local associations, and regional cultures. And in that world, England and Scotland are already building muscle memory, selection, style, preparation, and the rhythm of big matches. Ireland are still assembling the foundations. The key driver on the Irish side is people, organizers, the type football history doesn't celebrate enough. And one name matters more than most, John McAlery. He's a Belfast man who falls in love with the game after seeing it in Scotland, helps found Cliftonville in 1879, and then helps push the big step, creating the Irish Football Association in 1880, so Irish football can organize itself instead of improvising week to week. By 1881, the Irish Cup exists, and now the logic is irreversible. If you want a football nation, you need a national team. If you want a national team, you need a first match, even if it's terrifying. So Ireland invite England, and England accept and show up in Belfast with the kind of cohesion you only get from repetition, not necessarily because they're better athletes, but because their football ecosystem is already training them for this. Bloomfield isn't Wembley, it isn't Hampden. It's a ground tied to a local club, Knock, and is hosting a national moment. There's real excitement, curiosity, pride, and a sense that Ireland are stepping onto football's biggest stage. And then the whistle goes, and the stage feels very big. The match itself becomes an education delivered at full speed. Ireland's team is heavily Belfast-based, drawn from the clubs that exist, the clubs that are organized, and the clubs that can supply players on short notice. John McAlery is there, of course, captain, 32 years old. And on the outside left, they have Samuel Johnston, just 15 years old. England arrived with a team full of men who played high-level fixtures and understand spacing, support, and combination play in a way that Ireland simply haven't had time to develop together. And then the scoring starts. 1 becomes 3, 3 becomes 7, and by the second half, the crowd isn't counting goals, they're counting minutes. The names on the England side become a roll call of a particular kind of football cruelty, the kind that isn't malicious, just inevitable. Howard Wharton scores 5. Arthur Brown scores 4. That's 9 goals between these two. Both represented Aston Villa, and both played their first international. For a statistician, this is gold. Jimmy Brown adds 2, and Charlie Bambridge, England's captain, gets 1, and so does Henry Kersham. And yes, even in 1882, football has its little footnotes of rule-making experimentation. In this match, there's a moment that speaks to how the laws were still being stress-tested in public. A goal is awarded under an experimental provision relating to deliberate handling to stop a goal, a reminder that the referee's role and the game's relationship with justice was still being negotiated. Final score, 13-0. Ireland have not just lost, they've been introduced to the difference between having football and having a football system. Now, the immediate aftermath. In one sense, it's humiliating. It's the kind of scoreline that follows you around history. But in another sense, it's the start of something that has to start somewhere. A first international is a declaration: we exist, and Ireland's football existence is now official, regardless of the score. The proof is what happens next. Just a week later, Ireland scored their first international goals in their second match. And one of the most striking details is that early Irish international football is young in every sense. Teenagers are involved. The program is learning in public. But the long arc is the real story. For years, Ireland are outgunned. England and Scotland are the dominant forces, and Ireland, like Wales, are building their identity match by match, beating their heads against the highest wall in the sport. And yet, even within the rivalry, you can see the slow movement. Exactly 17 years later, February 18, 1899, England scored 13 again, but this time Ireland scored 2. It's still a chasm, but it's not the same chasm. And in between, Irish football isn't standing still. Irish clubs even enter the FA Cup in the late 1880s, a strange and wonderful moment when the board of English football is porous enough that clubs from Belfast can be part of the world's oldest knockout competition. Then comes the breakthrough that would have felt impossible back in Bloomfield in 1882. Ireland's first win over England arrives in 1913. And in 1914, Ireland win the home championship, a genuine peak, and a reminder that even an origin story that begins 13-0 can still produce a summit. And then history, politics, and identity reshape everything. After partition, the football story splits too. The IFA in the north, the FAI in the south. Selection disputes, naming disputes, eligibility disputes, a footballing reflection of a wider reality. And over time, the team that began life as Ireland in 1882 becomes what we now call Northern Ireland. So what did 13-0 do in the biggest sense? Well, it helped define why internationals mattered, not just as entertainment, but as feedback loops for development. It also helped cement the home nations as football's first international ecosystem. Annual matches, shared opponents, shared standards, and inevitably, shared hierarchies. And it left us with a brutal but important truth. Early international football wasn't designed to be fair. It was designed to exist. And existence comes first. Ireland 0, England 13 is not a romance. It's a starting gun. It's the day a football nation walked into the exam hall for the first time and discovered the syllabus had been taught elsewhere for a decade. But the fact it showed up matters. Because without that day, there's no next match, no slow learning curve, no eventual winners, no home championship title, and no later Northern Irish identity in football. And then no history to argue about. And football history is nothing if not an argument, right? Here are 3 things to take away. First, football becomes real when it organizes. Cups, associations, selection, routine. Ireland's 13-0 is what it looks like when one side has the system and the other is still building it. Second, international football begins as an experiment, not only in playing style, but in governance, refereeing, and the rules. Even this match carries the fingerprints of the sport, still writing its own operating manual. And third, heavy defeats don't just scar nations, they can also accelerate them. Ireland's first international is a lesson delivered brutally, but it's still a lesson. And Irish football spends the next decades turning that lesson into a program. On this day in 1882, Ireland played its first international, and England responded with 13 goals. A result so savage, it didn't just announce a match, it announced the gap between football nations and the long road it takes to close it. That's all for episode 110 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history. If you enjoyed this one, please follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with a fellow football historian. Tomorrow, episode 111, Estudiantes begin their 2009 Copa Libertadores campaign by getting smashed 3-0 by Cruzeiro, only to fight their way all the way to the final, where they beat Cruzeiro. Football loves a boomerang. If you have ideas, corrections, or a story you want me to chase, you can always reach me at OTD@17lawsguy.com. See you tomorrow.